between the physicians and surgeons in our profession. Well, I did not know that in those days, as I was sort of gearing up to become a physician, and it had always been my dream. And dreams are where ideas and then accomplishments ultimately come from. It had never occurred to me that I couldn't be a physician. I hadn't realized the hard work. In fact, one of the things I discovered very quickly about my wife was it was just no use competing. So at medical school, she studied, and I played tennis. And we found that was a really good combo. And thankfully, she was able to teach me enough in between the tennis matches that I just eked my way through. In fact, I probably shouldn't tell you a story like this, but in England, when you do your medical finals, they also involve you in lots of clinical work where you see a whole bunch of what we call short cases. So they take you to a patient, they don't tell you anything about them, they just ask you a question, from the end of the bed to see what you're observing and what you're picking up. And it was interesting that I did really badly. I remember they handed me an ophthalmoscope. You know what an ophthalmoscope is? You know, to look in people's eyes. And after the examination, the examiner, who was a distinguished professor from another medical school, he said, "Dale," he said, "an ophthalmoscope is a useless instrument in your hands." So, needless to say, I was not feeling great about my prospects. And I remember when we were allowed to go, and before the official results came out, you could go and see, and our professor of pharmacology was the one who was talking with the medical students about their unofficial results. And he said to me, "Well, Dale, you passed." In England, everybody's called by their last name, so I was Dale, which is very confusing. Where's Dale Tony? Yeah. So, I mean, Tony Dale and a Dale Tony, I mean, what's the likelihood of this? Anyway, he says to me, "Well, Dale, you passed." And I said, "Oh, man," he said, "that's such a relief. I did so badly on my clinicals, I thought I was going to fail." And he looked it up and he said, "Actually, you did terribly." And the person wrote down, "Unless he does brilliant on all the rest of what he does, fail in." So I guess that was the flip side of the coin. I must have somehow lucked my way through the rest of it. But these are the little experiments that, in a funny way, become the germination of what you may become if you allow yourself to do so. And so, okay, I just wanted to see where we were on the slides. That's perfect. After I left medical school, I moved through, obviously, the rest of the hospital training you have to do, and then into family practice. And alongside my family practice, which is why I love what's going on in the DPC and the virtual primary care world, VPC. I found myself getting very engaged with physicians all over the country because you probably already picked up, and a number of you came and thanked me for sort of opening things last night in prayer. And my faith is very important to me as a part of the journey of what I found myself doing. And one of the things that I wanted to find a way to learn how to accomplish was how do you actively integrate what you claim are your core principles into your ordinary everyday life. And so I was a part of a group of physicians who started a thing called CPC. It stood for Caring Professions Concern. And what we were doing was we were learning to integrate our faith into our daily professional practice. Because as a physician, I believe I'm called to look after the whole person. And the whole person is not just a body and not just a mind, but it's also a spirit. There's the spiritual side of us. And here in Austin, where everything is weird, I guess I'm allowed to talk in these terms. That I think it's important that in whatever it is we're doing, we're trying to help bring people into wholeness. And we were talking about those concepts. This was back, going back into the late 70s and early 80s. And that work really exploded. And it was that work that actually led Felicity and I and our 4 kids. And we arrived here, I guess it was on Black Monday, Do you remember in '87? We arrived on the Sunday, and the Black Monday was the Monday when there was a huge stock market crash. And it was a fascinating weekend, actually, for us, because we were supposed to leave on the Saturday, but we actually left on the Sunday because England had the first hurricane that it had experienced since the Spanish Armada. Now, maybe you don't know what the Spanish Armada is. You know, the Spaniards very sensibly were trying to attack us. And thankfully, because they probably would have succeeded, there was a hurricane that wiped out their fleet. And this was 500 years previous. So it wasn't even on the radar screen, excuse the pun, of the weather people that it was possible for England to be hit by a hurricane. And as we got up to go to the airport, we couldn't see out of the windows. And when we opened, the reason was they were covered with mud and the house next door had no roof. And we were staying with Felicity's parents on a little seaside village where they lived, and there were large yachts blown up onto the road. It was extraordinary. So that followed by Black Monday. I remember being in the airport and hearing someone, and I thought, like, this is a scene out of Dallas. There's this beautiful woman, and she's on the phone, and she's saying to whoever she's talking to, and yeah, and I think we've lost $20 million. And I thought, you mean people like that really exist? So that was my introduction to America. Little did I know what would happen to this English family doctor. As you gathered there, I had an injury. It led by accident, but the accident unfortunately was to me, into the whole world of what happens with medical cost containment. And so let's have a little look and think about this journey that I personally have been on and that Sedera has been on over these last years. If this diagram tried to give you some idea of what we want to accomplish, okay, part of our vision is to make high-quality, human, transparent solutions the new normal in healthcare. Okay, well, that little square at the bottom of 2018, the dark blue, is way too big. Even if you included what we're doing in Sedera, if you included what's happening with DPC, if you include what's happening in the emerging surgery centers that are growing up around the country, if you look at all of the free market expressions put together, we're barely a blimp in that bottom right-hand corner right now. When you consider that healthcare is 20% of the whole sort of economic process of what's going on in the United States, we're barely enough that if they wanted to just stomp on us and find a way to stop what we're doing politically, which of course is entirely possible, then we'd probably disappear and we wouldn't even be a footnote in history. But maybe, just maybe, there's a purpose that goes beyond all the things that we ordinarily see. And if you don't have a sense of vision, a sense of purpose, then you can cast your net into such a small area when actually there is an enormous need for what Sedera and all the rest of the free market medical system that is emerging to accomplish. There's so much that can be done if all of us are willing to really do what it takes. And part of what I'm hoping that I can communicate this morning is that actually there seems to be a grassroots movement emerging that says there has to be a better way to do this. There has to be. And so, as a vision, I want to put here at the beginning, wouldn't it be nice if within the next 4 or 5 years, this was a recognizable something within the healthcare world in the United States? If everybody was taking for granted that, you know, these people who are saying that the cash payer really should be the dominant form of handling healthcare costs have something really important to teach us. I mean, even now, and this is sort of after 25 years of working within this sphere, initially through the CARES group, the first company we started to deal with medical cost containment. When we began talking to hospitals and clinics about cash pay back in the mid-90s, they didn't know what we were talking about, literally. Many of the providers had no way of receiving a cash payment. In fact, they viewed anyone who was going to pay cash as a second-class citizen, as someone who, because they were a nuisance to the system, because this somehow implied that maybe they didn't have insurance, that they were a nuisance, they were a pariah, they probably were trying to take advantage of the system. And I don't know if any of you would remember back sort of that far, but in those days, the cash pay price was a little bit like what you see on the back of a hotel door. Which is the list price for the hotel, which nobody in their right mind, and hopefully nobody even in their wrong mind, would ever dream of paying. And yet that was what was expected of the cash payer just 25 years ago. The system had so completely dominated, squeezed out the normal economic relationship between patient and provider, and the middleman had so firmly inserted themselves in the process that even the idea of being a cash payer was really viewed by the provider world as somewhat obscene. And so when you began trying to explain to people that actually the cash payer is the best possible person to have. I mean, imagine if you go into your dealership to buy a car, which of course the dealers love, and you say, well, I want to pay cash, and they say, oh, we don't receive cash. I mean, that's very ridiculous. I go down to HEB and I want to buy some groceries. Well, I want to pay you cash. It says it's legal tender, but it's not legal tender in the medical world. It's like your bazaar. And something happens when you begin to exert your economic right to say that it's appropriate that if I make a fair payment, I should receive a fairly priced service. And the whole idea came out, briefly in that video, that you could, in the same zip code, be paying $350 for an MRI or $3,500 for an MRI, isn't just obscene, but it's immoral. And I think part of what I hope I can communicate this morning is that we need to be developing a sense of moral outrage that the basic economic principles have been so perverted that the typical consumer, is there such a word? There really isn't a consumer in the medical world, because we've all become passive sort of passengers in this system where somebody else is going to take care of us. And so the typical things that would drive the consumer market have been warped out of the healthcare world in such a way that everybody profits on the back of the sickness of other people. Now, don't get me wrong, I have no problem with profit. I was talking with a friend just a couple of days ago. We were having lunch together. He's head of a significant VC firm here in town. And we were chatting through a variety of things. And he was asking me all sorts of questions about what we're doing in Sedera and what's going on in the medical world. And he heard me use that phrase, obscene profit. I said, oh, don't get me wrong. I love profit. I think profit is incredibly important. It's right core to human nature that if you do something, you want to profit from it. That's absolutely natural and normal. It drives the economic engine of the world. Do you know in the last 50 years that free market principles have brought half of the world's population out of abject poverty into something approaching the sort of lowest end of middle class, lowest in the sense of economic. And that's an incredible achievement, and that's happened through free market economics, getting right down to what one person wrote a book about called The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, where he was demonstrating that these principles are making, if you like, the capacity to enjoy consumerism And, consumerism is almost a dirty word, but, it's really nice to have clean water. It's nice to be able to wash your clothes. It's nice to be able to brush your teeth. There were huge numbers of people in the world who knew nothing about that until the last 50 years, where free market principles have made it possible for enormous numbers of people to be lifted out of poverty. Okay, this is a part of what is going on in something like this, because we're going to come back to this. But here in the United States, the healthcare system is in the process of destroying the economy of the middle class. And so we need to change that. And the last 5 years, while Sedera has been operating, have been the beginning of a journey. And I want you to understand something about the nature of the numbers, if I can put it that way. Now, this probably looks like the strangest graph to you, because this is a graph of our growth in membership. And you would probably say to yourself, well, Tony, that means nothing's happened in the first 4 years. Nothing. You can barely see the increase in the line. Okay, this is known as the power of the exponential. Okay, let me give you a little riddle. There was a king who was very well known and wealthy, and look at that, just what you want while you're speaking. There was a king who was very wealthy, and he ruled his subjects with great sort of power and abandonment, not really caring for what they did, and he was a passionate chess player. And so he offered that he was going to give an amazing prize to anyone in his kingdom who could beat him at chess. And this very, very poor man comes, and they play a game of chess, and lo and behold, the poor man beats the king. And the king says, well, then I have a riddle for you. I'm going to show you the power of numbers, since you're obviously good at numbers, tied up with the chess game we've just played. And he says, I hear this chessboard, and he says, I will give you right now $1 million, or I will give you 1 grain of rice on your first chess square, and 2 grains of rice on your second chess square, and 4 grains of rice on your third, and 8 grains of rice on your fourth, until we filled the whole chessboard with the grains of rice, however many I need to give you to fulfill the 64th square. Which should the poor man choose? The rice. By the 64th square, it'll be a pile as tall as Mount Everest. It'll be more rice than they've produced maybe in history in the nation of India, which thrives on rice. If you've been there, it's rice for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So that is the power of just multiplying twos. Okay, year 1, we grew by a factor of 3. Not by a factor of 2, but by a factor of 3. Year 2, we grew by a factor of 3. Okay, that makes you 9 times bigger than when you started in year 1. Okay, year 3, by a factor of 3. Okay, this is exponential growth. And there is something happening. The power of the exponential you can barely see in its early days. But if you can sustain it, okay, it can be absolutely transformative. And one of the things that is becoming clear in the world of economics and business is that there are a growing number of organizations of all types that are able to sustain exponential growth for extraordinarily long periods of time, basically following what's known as Moore's Law. Now, Moore's Law, I think most of you will be aware of, in the world of technology, is that Moore, who I think was with Intel, is that right? Yeah, okay. Have to speak to my wonderful CEO of the Keras Group, Kim Evans, who's here with us, because everything we have in Sedera grew out of our first sort of 20 years experience in Keras. And in Moore's Law, it says that where you're dealing with technology, the technology doubles in effectiveness and halves in cost every 18 months. And businesses that learn how to leverage the power of technology seem to be able to do the same thing. Which is why last night Jamie mentioned that Sedera really is in the process of morphing from a service company into a technology company, which does not mean that one isn't striving for even better service, but it means that the undergirding sort of power of the company is leveraging the impact of technology and the sharing economy. Whether you're talking Airbnb or an Uber or any of the other expressions, including Sedera, is leveraging the power of technology so that people can find ways to share without the middleman needing to get in the way, and can actually have a power to impact that sphere, which for us is healthcare cost. And if you apply Moore's law to what's going on here, whether it's sustainable for 5 years or for 15 years or for 50 years, I have no idea. Okay, but something powerful happens which has the ability to change the way that healthcare is paid for in this country. And I want to suggest that we represent a movement here that has the power to change the way that healthcare is paid for in the United States. That means we are in the process of changing the largest economic segment of what goes on in the most powerful and wealthy country that has ever existed. And so what might that look like? Okay, in the book of Proverbs, which is a book sort of smack in the middle of the Bible, obviously not everybody comes from my sort of faith perspective, but the principles and concepts are timeless. And King Solomon, who, known by many people as the wisest man who ever lived, although actually he gives all the credit to his dad, to King David, because the whole book of Proverbs begins by saying, my son, this is what I want you to learn. And here's the son writing it all down. It's what he had learned from his father, King David. And there's this fascinating verse in Proverbs 23 and verse 7 where it says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. I think it was Henry Ford who said, about what he had created with the, the assembly line, and, what he did with Ford Motor Company, was, if you think you can't do it, you're right. And if you think you can do it, you're right. So I want to ask you, what do you think you're doing right now in your involvement, not just with Sedera, but of what you've been called to be? All of us have our own sort of different part that we play within the broader sort of scheme of things. And it takes everybody. And it's absolutely going to take all of us really saying, I can accomplish much more than I've dared to believe so far. There's a story that Jesus told of a man with the talents. And he talks about someone who had 1 talent, and someone who had 2 talents, and someone who had 5 talents. And he says something very, very fascinating in that story. The person with 1 talent, if you remember the story, he buried his talent in the ground. And then when, in this story, the king came back from a far country and said, what did you do with the talent I gave you? The guy said, well, I knew you were a strong and, cruel ruler, and I wanted to make quite sure I didn't lose anything, and so I buried it here, and here's your whole talent back. And the king says, you wicked person. I gave you a talent, and all you did was bury it. And then the next guy comes along with the 2 talents, and he says, well, Master, you gave me 2, and while you've been gone, I've multiplied it, and it's become 4. And he says, oh, well done, good and faithful servant. Now, I love the fact he multiplied it. He didn't just add incrementally. He didn't add 10% interest. He had multiplied it in that time. I don't know how long the king was away in the story, but man, that's the sort of economics I like. And then the guy with the 5 talents, he comes to the king and says, well, while you've been gone, I've turned this into 10. And the king says, well done. I'm so glad. You know, and why would the king be glad? Because we love to see people prosper. Beloved, my desire for you, this was the Apostle John writing, he said, my desire for you is that you prosper and be in health. We live in a nation which has somehow been struggling with its identity. For me as a foreigner coming in, okay, I knew what the American dream was when I came here in 1987. It wasn't particularly the American dream that pulled me here, but at least I knew what it was. And it's fascinating to me that in the last sort of 30 to 40 years, it's almost like the nation has lost its capacity to dream. I guess there are rumblings, and you know, this isn't a place for, you know, politics or whatever, but there are changes going on where one senses that there is a part of society that believes that we're working from a limited pie, and that pie basically can only be divided among so many people, and so we need to grab as much as we can for ourselves. Okay, and then there is a part of society that says, no, there's abundance. There's abundance. You know, 20 years ago, we were going to run out of energy in 20 years or whatever. And now there's so much energy, we hardly know what to do with it, and the technology is dramatically changing everything. You know, in parts of Africa where, you know, just something as basic as water is the difference between life and death, people were saying everybody's going to starve. And now they're beginning to see the power of abundance when just very, very simple ecological principles are put to work, teaching people basic skills and how to make sure that they get clean water and the health that comes with that. You know, it's a matter of how you think. If you think it can't be done, then you give up and you go and live in your little hole somewhere and you look after number one. And if you begin to think in terms of abundance, you say, well, goodness, God, if you've given me 1 talent, I want to multiply it to 2. And if you've given me 2 talents, I want to multiply it into 4, because there's a world out there that desperately needs what we have and represent. I would suggest to you that what's going on in the healthcare world at the moment here in the United States is basically destroying the nation's middle class. The average healthcare cost for a family in the United States is now approaching $20,000 a year, depending on whose figures you look at. I've seen those figures go as high as $27,000. By the time you look at the premium cost, the co-pays and deductibles, and any other out-of-pocket expenses that people have. And that is pulling away from people's pay packet an extra 50% on average across the nation of what people could have if we could find a way to bring these costs back under control. And we are a part of change that can be brought into this system in such a way that that money can go back into people's pockets, where instead of it just being consumed by the black hole of sort of illness, it can begin to be used in such a way that we can teach people where with their health they can become productive and effective with the tools and the talents that God has given them. We're talking the power to bring transformation into society. Now, okay, I'm so glad this thing has a timer on it. That makes sure that I know exactly where I am. So this is the last slide. You know, we're almost done. What does NTP mean? Well, I'll tell you. If you are a lover of business literature like I am, you know, we can always be learning. It's one of the things I learned many years ago. In fact, it was shortly after I came here to the United States, I heard a motivational speaker. His name was Charlie Tremendous Jones. Only in America would a speaker be called Charlie Tremendous Jones. You know, I was getting used to America, and this is what Charlie Tremendous Jones said. He said, you know, 5 years from now, you'll be exactly the same as you are now, except for the people that you meet and the books that you read. And I've remembered that phrase. That was such a simple concept. I've gone out of my way ever since then that if there's someone I want to meet, I'll do whatever is necessary to get a meal with them. I'll take them out to a fancy restaurant. Because again, Charlie Jones said, he said, it's cheap at the price. Let's say it costs you $200 to take them to the best steakhouse in town, but you get an hour of their time and you get one idea that changes your life. That makes the $200 seem like nothing. The people you meet here are people who can transform what you're currently doing, whether that's as an affiliate, as a provider, as someone on our Sedera team. Okay, there's extraordinary power for transformation in people. Okay, so books and people are the key to beginning to shape the way that you think. Because as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. The M stands for massive. Massive. The T stands for transformational, and the P stands for purpose. I believe we represent the emerging beginning parts of a movement that has a massive transformational purpose. And all over the business world, I mean, just look it up on the internet if you want, you'll find people talking about the power of ideas to create a massive transformational purpose. Now you might say, oh, this is just Jim Collins' BHAG, resurrected in a different form. A big, hairy, audacious goal. Well, we need big, hairy, audacious goals, but there's more to it than that. Okay, because even the language, this is massive. Okay, whatever you've thought so far, what if I told you that doesn't even need to be the beginning of defining what could be true? In Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 20, you probably gather I'm a person who loves the book. And in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 20, it says this. It says, he is able to do exceeding abundantly beyond all you dared to ask or imagine. Now, I've got a great imagination. I'm an ideas guy. I'm sort of pretty useless at the practical, down-to-earth stuff. That's why I have to hire fantastic people like Jamie and others, because I'm too lazy to do the work myself. But I love the ideas. But I have someone who is the source of all wisdom. In him are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Why don't we avail ourselves of what God makes available to us? Why don't we dare to imagine that he really can do something that is exceedingly abundantly beyond all we've so far dared to ask or imagine? Into that sort of context, we could really do something that changes this nation. And we're starting at the grassroots, and we're working in such a way that we believe we can impact every fragment of society, because by touching people at their health, we touch their ability to live. And if we can start to teach people what it means to be healthy, rather than to assume that when they get sick, frequently because of the choices they've made themselves, that there's someone else who can put them together again. The American medical system is proof that Humpty Dumpty's story is true. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Okay, but if we can help people begin to take responsibility for themselves, and we can show what happens in a vibrant community of people who've chosen to live healthy, and who are willing to take the economic consequence of that choice, and instead of trying to offload their responsibility either to their employer through their work insurance or through the government, through some sort of government handout, we begin to encourage people that as we make our own choices, that's what most profoundly impacts every aspect of our economic life and of our physical and emotional life. And into that, we're going to see dramatic change. So I want to leave you in closing with a quote from probably my favorite author, or blogger, I guess I should say. And that's a guy called Seth Godin. If you haven't read any of Seth Godin's stuff, I'd encourage you. If you don't know where to start on books or ideas that transform, Seth is a brilliant business writer. In his blog just 2 days ago, this is what he said. The blog's title is Impossible. Our days are filled with the path to future skills, tasks, and commitments that we believe we can't possibly take on. We've seduced ourselves into believing that we're not born with the talent or that the obstacles for doing the work are just too great. In fact, it's more likely that we've simply decided that the work isn't worth the effort. Or maybe the fear of failure is too much to bear. But it's not impossible. We just don't care enough. I want to challenge you to care. Thank you very much.